All right, Ryan. So I was sitting on the set of Fox and Friends this weekend. I had never heard your story. And you were being interviewed by my co-host, Pete Hegseth, and I immediately, as sometimes during the commercial breaks we do, read our notes, read our phones, my eyes immediately shot up. My ears immediately opened. And I was like, I want to hear this guy's story. And I immediately knew I want to hear it in more detail. So thank you for being with me today, Ryan. And I would love for you to share with us your story.
Absolutely. It's amazing. My wife and I started the Radiance Foundation. It's our nonprofit organization that's partly based on my story, also based on her story, that really just illuminates that every human life has purpose. So when people talk to me about the issue of abortion, why do you care? You're a guy. Well, okay, none of us come into existence without a male and a female, so that's why every guy should be concerned about it. But I'm particularly moved to be involved in the fight for life because of my own origin story. I was adopted and loved in a family of 15. I have 9 other siblings who were also adopted. We're white, we're black, we're Native American, Vietnamese, able, disabled, just a beautiful mixture. But many of us have stories where the world says that we should have been aborted. And I'm definitely one of those where my birth mom experienced the horror and the violence of rape. But she was courageous enough not only to give me life, but gave me the incredible gift of adoption. And so that's why I'm particularly motivated to fight for the most marginalized among the marginalized. And, now today I'm a happily married man. My wife, Bethany, was a woman who faced an unplanned pregnancy in her 20s and had so much pressure from her fellow teachers saying, just abort it, just abort it. And she rejected the violence of abortion too. And that baby girl was named Radiance, the reason for the name of our organization. And we're married with 4 kiddos, 2 of whom were also adopted, including that baby girl, Radiance, who is now 17 years old. So that's kind of in a nutshell what my story is and why I'm so passionate about defending human life.
What a wonderful story. As you begin telling your story and you tell us, people say to you, why do you have an opinion? You're a guy. And you highlight there are many other dynamics involved in this debate other than one's genitalia. I think it was Ronald Reagan that once said, I noticed this one common characteristic of everyone who has an opinion on abortion. They are alive. Right. And that really is what this conversation is about. It is about, as you pointed out, life. And you have a line that rivals Reagan's in that you say, you are the 1 in 100 that becomes, or rather the 1 in 1,000 perhaps, that becomes the 100% part of this debate, meaning the exception for rape and incest always 100% of the time becomes part of the debate over abortion. And it's interesting, Ryan, the entire conversation is one that for the most part, and I know that pro-abortion activists won't like what I'm about to say, but for the most part is either theoretical or philosophical. It's rarely actually one of life experience. And that can only be told by someone like you.
Right. And they don't like telling my story either. That's why, I've been invited to be on CNN or MSNBC. I was on there once. They did not invite me back because I don't fit their narrative. Their only narrative is that an unplanned situation can only lead to misery, that it's only about women, and they don't want to tell the stories that actually prove their narratives wrong. So when I say I'm the 1% that's used 100% of the time to justify abortion, it's because they are the ones, mainstream media mostly, not Fox News, and a handful of others, but the majority of mainstream media are constantly exploiting the tragedy of rape, like my origin story, in order to promote the further violence of abortion. They don't want to hear these stories because they understand that when people do see them and they do hear them, it changes their hearts and changes their minds.
Yeah, it's your very existence is the unrebuttable proposition. The fact that you are here is sort of the end of the conversation. So I would love to stay on the note of your story. What do you know? I know that adoption is a big part of your story and a big part of your cause, and I do want to talk about adoption. But your origin, that you were conceived out of this incredibly horrific act of rape, what do you know about it? Do you know your birth mother? Do you know your birth father? Do you know much about that story?
there's not a lot that I know other than the information that was given to the agency that handled the case. I actually was able to, in my late 20s, I actually talked to the social worker who handled my case. And so I have scant details about my birth mom, who was young, who was actually a foster child herself, who was estranged from her family. She had been in the military, and she did not know, at least from what I know from the agency, she did not know the rapist. And so I don't know who the biological father is. I've actually never met my birth mom, though I did search for her years ago. There was I conducted this search. I had to actually have my records unsealed by a judge. So I wrote a letter, and I said in the letter, I don't actually have to meet her. I just want her to know how grateful I am that she made that decision. And so I had written a song called Meant to Be, and I included, this is years ago, so I included a CD. People still know what a CD is, but included CDs of that song. And that's all I wanted. I wanted her to know how grateful that I was. And so they kept that search open longer than the normal time frame. I think it was normally open for 6 months. They kept it open almost a year, but there was no response. So at this point, I've never met my birth mom. I've not been able to connect or communicate, but I still want to communicate the same thing. I want to thank her for going through 9 months of a traumatic pregnancy and causing beautiful reverberations that will last for generations.
Yeah, what thank you, first of all, for allowing me to ask that question and for indulging me with an answer. She's such a huge part of this story. People, obviously, for anyone that truly understands the philosophy or the philosophical origins of the conversation that you and I need to have of when life begins, it really doesn't. That question and its answer doesn't have anything to do with how the life begins. And that doesn't deny the trauma that your mother, your birth mother, experienced and had to, as you pointed out, had to continue to experience for 9 months as a reminder, I would assume, of what happened to her. But what a courageous decision she made to endure that trauma so that you are alive. And I know for so many that don't want to make the rape in incest, or who do make the rape and incest exception, it is about that trauma that your mother experienced. But on the other side of it is you.
Right. And we can't forget about the trauma that she goes through. The problem is she is not healed by the further violence of abortion. And this is something that I discovered. I speak all over the country, speaking a lot of college campuses and conferences, and I meet a lot of individuals who've experienced this. It's partly because they've come to the event because they know of my story. But I meet rape survivors, those who've become mothers through rape, those who've chosen abortion, actually, and those who've chosen adoption. And the amazing thing to me, even as someone conceived in rape but adopted in love, the amazing thing to me was that there was a common thread that ran through their stories, and that was the child was the only redemptive part of such a horrific act. And so here you have, people pushing abortion, all these people, the hucksters pushing every pink euphemism, waving all these pink banners, and not actually offering wholeness and healing. That's what those who experience the violence of rape need. Not an abortionist who is not going to be there for her, who's not going to be able to undo the violence done to her. I mean, they don't ever want to talk about the punishment of the rapist. Why don't they ever talk about the punishment of the rapist? They're constantly going right to the child and assuming that abortion will actually bring healing to a woman. And even no matter the reason why a woman has an abortion, there are physiological, psychological, emotional, and spiritual consequences to that. And they want to pretend that doesn't happen in these cases. But they use this all the time. And we have to remember that the origin of Roe v. Wade, was a lie about rape. Norma McCorvey, who was Jane Roe, lied that she had been raped. That's how the whole case started, because they tried to enable her to have an abortion in the state of Texas where it was illegal. So rape has been exploited for a long time when it comes to the issue of abortion.
So I want to ask you another question. I hope you'll forgive me, because it is obviously this entire conversation is so deeply personal. But when I hear the arguments of the pro-choice, pro-abortion camp, they really kind of almost fall into two lines of thought. One is, how could you ever force a woman to endure something she doesn't want to endure, whether or not it was conceived out of rape or through choice and behavior? How can you tell a woman what to do with her body? That is one line of argument. The other line of argument is perhaps more horrific, and it is the paternalistic, I would have to say, eugenicist mindset of, why would you bring a child into the world who is determined or bound or fated to this miserable existence? That's most often focused, Ryan, on children with special needs. But I would think that even for children of rape, that some of that paternalistic eugenicist mindset would extend. I'm just curious, your origin story, what type of role has it played for you psychologically?
It's huge. I mean, to say that, well, one, when you're adopted out of a situation of brokenness, that's how adoption happens. It's an act of love that actually brings wholeness and healing to those situations. And as an adoptive father, I understand that too from a different perspective. But it's such a profoundly evil eugenic mindset. Remember, eugenics actually was anti-adoption. In fact, Henry Goddard, who coined the term moron, he was the one behind developing the IQ test, said that adoption is a crime against the family because you don't know the heredity and you don't know the future of that child. Well, you don't know the future of your biological child. But eugenics was deeply anti-adoption, and still Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry demonize adoption all the time. So when I think about that whole mindset that they're constantly pushing this whole thing about, well, look at this tragic circumstance. How many times have I been called in social media, you're the demon seed and you're the rapist child. Well, guess what? I was also her child. And she made a decision that was truly empowering. So when they talk about my body, my choice, they don't really actually care about the woman's body. If they did, they wouldn't fight, for instance, all the women's right to know bills. Because they truly believe it's your body, your choice. Well, shouldn't she be able to make an informed choice? Shouldn't she understand the resources that are available out there? And we saw during COVID, of course, that whole my body, my choice was shattered because the same pro-abortion activists are demanding that your body be injected with a vaccine. So there's so much about that mantra. It sounds great, but in actuality, there's nothing real to it. And that's not real compassion. Real compassion is saying, I see your hurt, I see your trauma, and let's do everything we can to keep you safe and to elevate you and the other human life involved. And I'm just grateful that I believe someone spoke that hope into my birth mom. Someone had to have for her to hold on for 9 months.
Once again, your existence is the only necessary rebuttal. It's odd in this world where it seems like what they would suggest is the crux of the debate is about choice. They prescribe for you this fatalistic outcome in life. I can't believe somebody on social media would call you what you just described. But I do think that there is this paternalistic mindset, Ryan, that they would like, oh, well, he is destined for a life of destitution. He's a child. He's a child of rape. He could not possibly have a fruitful and fulfilling existence. And Here you are, not only existing, but as you pointed out, and I want to get to, continuing the cycle of love that was your adoption.
Yes, exactly. And I'll tell you, one of those places wasn't just social media. It was actually during a debate at Harvard where the professor debating me constantly kept reminding me how I didn't deserve to live. And then after I shared my story of the courage of my birth mom, and this is a professor who's focused on women's studies and particularly on rape culture on campus. So after I share my story of my birth mom experienced the violence of rape and yet still being stronger than her circumstances, the professor kept saying, oh, well, that's a cute story. Well, that's a cute story. And then proceeded to talk about how I didn't deserve to live because I wasn't planned. I mean, this is such a warped mindset and such an arrogant mindset. What gives her life more value? We all have equal and irrevocable value, but somehow some of us pretend that we can be the arbiters of that value and say a certain group of human beings doesn't deserve to live.
I just don't understand that. I don't understand that whatsoever. You could sit in front of someone else whose existence is obvious to you in the same physical space and go, your life isn't worthy because of the way it began, because of its origin, and feel like they have the moral high ground.
I know. I mean, did they control the circumstances of their conception? I don't think anybody does. Well, we all know that nobody does. That's why it's so haughty to think that you somehow believe that your life has more value, more worth. And so this is the mindset. This is the DNA of the abortion industry. This is the eugenic mindset where some people are superior to others.
So before we move on to the redemptive part of the story, the whole thing is a redemptive part. As we pointed out, your mother's choice is a redemptive part of this story. I am curious about one thing then, where this leads you. from a policy perspective. It really has, the conversation you and I are having, by the way, really has nothing to do with the Supreme Court's decision over Roe v. Wade. That only turned the question back to democracy, and what states will now choose will be a question of open debate and persuasion. As states look at this, I'm just curious where your personal experience, and obviously you're very invested intellectually and philosophically in this conversation as well, religiously, I'm sure as well. I'm curious where it leads to for you from a perspective of policy. Do you think abortion should be outlawed, including instances of incest and rape?
Oh, I have worked since my wife and I started the Radiance Foundation almost 14 years ago now to abolish abortion and abolish it for any reason. Obviously, there are the exceptions in the case, for instance, of the physical life of the mother, ectopic pregnancy, which is very different than elective abortions. We aren't a lobbying organization, but our focus has not necessarily been on any kind of the lobbying, although there have been instances where I have spoken in favor of human life amendments and other similar bills. My focus is really on sharing my story so that people can see the other side of things. It's not necessarily, trying to convey some sort of mandate that everyone has to abide by this. But the problem with the exceptions, and this is where pro-abortion activists always go off the rails. They always insist, well, we have to have all these exceptions. Well, we have to remember that abortion started with exceptions. For instance, the 1967 Therapeutic Abortion Act that Ronald Reagan signed. It was because of the life of the mother, rape, and incest. Well, guess what? That blew up into over 100,000 a year being aborted in California. So these things start off with the exceptions and then they become the norm. And so that's why there is a push to remove these exceptions, except for the physical health, physical life actually of the mother, because it always goes to these places. And who determines that? Who determines what these exceptions cases are? The same unethical physicians that are the abortionists, they're the ones who make these determinations. And so there's a reason why, from a policy standpoint, you don't want to have these exceptions, because you'll have abortionists constantly writing off, oh, it was because of this, it was because of rape, it was because of incest. That's part of the reason why you want to remove some of these exceptions. But my argument has often been, okay, I'll say to pro-abortion activists, how about we give you the less than 1% of abortions that are due to rape and incest? How about I say, I give that to you, even as someone conceived in rape, I give that to you. Will you give me the other 99%? And of course, the answer is always the same. No, it's either silence or no, or some sort of, 4-letter word before the no. But that goes to show how much they will exploit the mess out of the violence of rape in order to justify all these other elective abortions that have nothing to do with that. So that's why the bigger issue is that these exceptions cases, or these exceptions written into these bills, aren't really the issue. The issue is the other 99% of abortions that the pro-abortion side want unfettered access to. And not only unfettered access to, they want every American taxpayer to pay for those abortions.
Okay, so your origin story is only in part one of an act of violence. It's also, as you point out, an act of love, because it's your adoption, it's your family. So tell me first about your adoptive parents. You mentioned you were, I think you said, one of 15. What did you learn through this act of love?
Oh, my goodness. Well, our family was 15 total. There were 13 kids, including, I guess you could say, a 14th one who was temporarily with us from Guatemala. He was there for medical reasons. My family is definitely not your typical American family. I mean, I was the first one adopted, and apparently it went really well. So then there was a new flavor added to the family every year. I'm serious. It was, I mean, people look at our family and they would say things like, is this a youth group? Like, no, it's our family. But my parents, Henry and Andrea Bomberger, really were I have to say it this way. My mom is still alive. My father is not. My father passed away during COVID. He suffered 12 years of Parkinson's and ended up, one of the people in the assisted living facility who was locked down for almost a year, because that's compassion. Anyway, he passed away in 2021 on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. But I'll tell you, my parents loved all of us. They actually showed us what being pro-life truly is. I mean, when people use that bumper sticker mantra and say, pro-lifers don't care about children after they're born, I'm like, what are you talking about? We are the ones who care about people after they're born. My parents lived that out. They, at their own, I mean, the amount of self-sacrifice is just even hard to describe from my parents. My mom, for instance, when she adopted me, I have brown skin. I don't know if you noticed that, but when my parents adopted me, she had an alcoholic father. In fact, my mom's, let me go back a little further. My mom's passion for adoption began when she was 5. She was placed in a children's home for a year because her parents were separating. She had an alcoholic father. So my mother grew up in extreme brokenness. And that 1 year's time in that children's home is what gave her the heart to be a mom to those who didn't have one. Fast forward to them adopting me, and still as an adult trying to connect with her father, who had been involved with the original Bombergers. So there were 3 original or homemade ones, I don't know what you want to call them, but the first 3 Bomberger children, and then I was adopted, so I was the 4th child. But the moment they adopted me, her father said, I'll sanitize this a little bit. If you bring that black child into your home, you're going to ruin your family. And so from that moment on, he had been involved with the Bomberger family up until that point, but from that moment on, he had nothing to do with our family the rest of our lives. So the amount of self-sacrifice from my parents is just unbelievable. They truly showed us what it means to rescue and redeem, and they unleashed God-given purpose in all of us, whether biological or adopted. Now our family is 76 strong with my brothers, sisters, and their spouses and their children. My nieces and nephews are adoptive parents. I mean, the legacy of love continues. And so that's just been my experience. It's not all, happiness and butterflies. Adoption is a struggle. There are joys, there are failures, there are triumphs. But I look back and I think of how my parents' love rescued and transformed our lives, and they rewrote the narratives that the world had put on us.
And I take it's a rainbow coalition of a family, as you mentioned. You mentioned Guatemala. Yeah. I don't know how you describe it, the original Bombergers, and then you've got someone right in the family, in the nuclear family of adoption that is in your. I'm not talking about your family today, meaning your adopted children, but in your brothers and sisters' home. It sounds like people hailed from every different imaginable background.
There are a lot of different, we understood diversity. That was just normal and natural for us. The thing is that we love all that diversity, and we love all that, for instance, all the different hues of skin, but we grew up in a family where we believe strongly that we're just one human race. It's not about being colorblind, but understanding that God creates not only different hues of skin, but these different experiences that were then woven together into a single family. So I know a little bit about diversity. It's just been so distorted and perverted today. When you hear about diversity, particularly from the left, they don't truly understand it, nor do they truly appreciate it.
And now you've carried on the tradition. You have 5, yes. Is it 5 adopted children of your own?
No, I have 4 children, 2 of whom were adopted. So
I see. I'm
in that holding pattern. I'm not. We're willing to go even more. We're open to even more adoptions, but I have 4 currently, and they're amazing. What
inspired you to start the process of adoption? Did you know you would always do that based upon the family dynamic growing up, or after? I guess I'm making another assumption I don't know about 2 birth children. What made you decide to adopt?
Oh, from day one. I wanted to adopt since I was in elementary school. So
okay.
I had an amazing father who taught us, one, how to love, be just an incredible husband, how to be an incredible father. And so I had a great role model. But I'll tell you, since I was seriously a kid, I've always wanted to be a father, and I always wanted to be an adoptive father. So that was something kind of just in my DNA from day one. When my wife and I, we were engaged, one of her questions was so interesting to me, because she said, "Are you going to be able to love my daughter the way you'll love the rest of our children?" Now, remember, her daughter, Radiance, was her biological daughter from another relationship that she had walked away from, an abusive relationship she walked away from. And I said, "Have you met me? Do you know me? I was the first one adopted. I'm the favorite in the family. I will love her just as much." And of course, now she's 17, and I have an 11, 13, 14, and 17-year-old, and they're all loved equally. They're all loved like crazy. But it was never a question. And for her, she had no adoption in her background. So this was something completely new. And now as adoptive parents, we've been on this journey for so many years, and we are just passionate advocates for adoption, which is why, I mentioned the Henry and Andrea Bomberger Adopted and Loved Fund. That's part of our organization's effort, the Radiance Foundation, to help give grants to families who are providing a forever home for vulnerable children. That's how passionate we are. We put our money where our passion is.
I need to follow my own personal curiosity for just one moment. You said two things that lead to questions I just have to ask and want to know. First of all, you said adoption's a struggle. Look, I have two boys of my own, biological children. Parenting's a struggle, right? Raising human beings is a struggle. I'm curious, what in your vast experience now on both sides, the parent and the child of adoption, what uniquely is a struggle about adoption?
Well, part of the unique struggle of adoption is societal stigma about adoption, where people still apologize to me when they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, are you uncomfortable talking about adoption?" I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not uncomfortable. I am so grateful for adoption. So there are still so many misperceptions about adoption, and so that's part of that struggle because people still don't understand. For instance, when I was at the funeral for my grandfather, our whole Bomberger family was lined up, and like I mentioned, there are a ton of us, so it was the longest receiving line ever. But I had an aunt who walked up and said to one of my sisters, who is one of the biologically related children to child, one of the biologically related children, I can't get my words out, to my parents. And they said, "Well, how does this make your real brother and sister feel?" And I'm standing right next to them like, what? How have you known us all of our lives and you could actually ask a question like that? So part of it is just some of the ignorance, and I don't mean that in a mean sense, but just the ignorance about adoption. Some of the other struggles are just the brokenness that led to the need for adoption in the first place. For instance, some of my siblings, all of us were adopted out of foster care. Some of my siblings were horrifically abused, physically and sexually. And so you're dealing with some of those dynamics without actually having firsthand knowledge of all of those encounters, all of those instances. And so that's part of the struggle. But that's why when you love unconditionally and you love relentlessly, it changes things. You look at my siblings' lives and how many of the medical professionals and other types of professionals had such a negative, prediction of who we would become. And they were wrong. They were all wrong. I mean, you're talking about people with master's degrees. I have a master's degree. Some of my siblings who were adopted have master's degrees, to have families, to be pastors, to be deeply involved in their communities. I mean, they defied the world's low expectations. And part of the struggle of adoption is that the world still has really low expectations about adoption.
The second question I was going to ask you out of curiosity, I think you just inadvertently answered. And I think, and I'm just going to sound this out with you, and it's going to be a little bit less of a question and more of a thought. I think that I personally, and I think many of us, have pursued parenting as an act of perfection. In other words, how can I optimize this individual? How can I help them be their optimum self or their best version of themselves? And then that puts it into this realm of, well, I want them to be in the right coaching if they're into sports, and I want them to get the right academics. Not the right, actually the best. We want them to have the best of every single thing. And I was going to ask you, and I don't know your situation on the children you've adopted, and you just told me about some of your siblings. You have different levels of ability to leave an imprint on a child depending upon how quickly or how long you have them. So what age you adopt them. I'm sure my ability to mold a young man who I would adopt at the age of 12 is less than my ability to mold a son who's born into my household, right? So, right. But I wanted to ask you about that ability. But I, in listening to you talk, I also realized the folly, the ignorance of my own question, because parenting isn't all about molding and about perfecting this person or even optimizing this person's life. It's just about loving. And so I guess you adopt a son at 13 years old and he comes from a traumatic background. My job isn't to optimize to him or optimize his future life. My job is to love him.
Yeah. And that does change everything. I'm not speaking in some sort of cliche. I've lived that, And the whole point is not necessarily the time spent, because what happens in adoption, this is part of the misconception about adoption, is that people think it's what you're doing for that child. But adoption is a reciprocal sort of act of love, that you're changed as a parent. And so every time there was a new child and new experiences that brought into the family, it changed the DNA of the family. And it changed it beautifully. And I know that now as an adoptive father, that's what happens, because the biological children in the family get impacted. As I mentioned, I have siblings, I have nephews and nieces who are adoptive parents. I have siblings who are now adoptive parents. There's something that happens. There's this exchange that happens in that whole process. And so I have, siblings who were adopted as teenagers, yes. But yet I would say, for instance, one of my sisters, and she says this all the time, she was adopted as a teenager at 14, and yet she feels just as grafted into the family as everyone else. She loves my parents. They're her mom and her dad. And yet you have some who were adopted as babies who maybe not as close, but that's because of those are the personal choices, some ideological choices that they made. So there's so many dynamics that go into that whole mix. Not telling parents don't do your best, to provide for your kids and to provide the best opportunities and expect, the best out of them. Yeah, we want to do that too. But there are a lot of dynamics that go into the mix of becoming who we are.
Well, Ryan, listen, as I mentioned, when I first heard your story in brief on Fox from this weekend, I just knew I wanted to hear it in more detail. And I would love to even talk to you more, honestly, about adoption. It is, by the way, it's a concept that I'm personally fascinated and curious about. But I think I still have some evolution to do on that in understanding someone's role. And I'm starting to sound it out with you right now. But, life isn't about conquer. Life is about love. Yeah, and I think I really appreciate you sharing your origin story of violence, but more importantly, your redemption story of love. I really appreciate this time. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Will. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.